Hello, everybody. I'm Fabrice Verdi, the director of RUTA Architecture Center, hosting your event today in the auditorium here, which we share with the Contemporary Arts Center of the City of Bordeaux. I'm delighted to welcome you here today for these 2 days of very intense work on a subject very dear to us. And as an introduction with the team, we wanted to offer you 3 images of a project as a gift on the theme of your meeting. So Arc en Rêve for many years has always worked on questions of how architecture and urbanism projects have direct impacts on the environment and living spaces. And the 3 images you're seeing here on the screen correspond to an exhibition presented in 2021, Arboretum, the Tree as Architecture, which has been transferred to the Basque Country Architecture Centre now, and to show how plants and trees have always, for centuries, played a role in the areas around them and interacted with architecture. And here we tried to avoid some of the cliches about nature and architecture. Since ancient times, these 2 things have been linked together and interacted with each other. And for this, we thought this could be a good opening for your 2 days. Here you have a supermarket in 1980 by James Wines from the Site architecture firm, who over a number of years designed a number of supermarkets for Best. Here it's in Richmond, Virginia. And the architect, when he was assigned this job, found these trees on the site, and rather than cutting the trees down, which would perhaps have been the normal choice made by the client to build the frontage of the supermarket, which is always so important in the US to attract clients driving past in their cars, he suggested setting the facade back, placing it among the trees, so that customers coming into the supermarket would come over the threshold and walk down, pass through an area with trees, and then finally into the building. And this expresses the way we would like the architecture between nature and architecture to be. And that architecture should adapt to the needs and intentions of the trees, which should be considered as personalities in their own right, even if they don't speak. And this relationship between the built environment, the buildings, and the plants or trees also plays a role in the way the land is used in cities. One final detail, if you look at the image here, we have this slightly ironic gesture as if a monster had demolished the building, which suggests that architecture perhaps doesn't always have to be entirely respectful. It can be ironic, and it's also interesting to bear in mind that to allow these trees to survive here between the frontage and the building, it required a lot of engineering design to transfer all the utility networks and change the foundations of the building to allow space for the trees. So this is our gift today to open today's proceedings. And I will now hand over to Pierre Urmic, Mayor of Bordeaux, and enjoy your stay here and make the most of these 2 very important days. Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you, Fabrizio, for welcoming us here in the Lenné warehouse, Arc en Rêve, an iconic building of the city of Bordeaux, and we're delighted to be welcoming you here today. Thank you also for your introductory words, which fit in perfectly with the subject, with this relationship between trees and buildings, a building of friendship, as you said. The photograph you showed us of that shopping mall was a perfect illustration of that relationship of friendship which should exist between buildings and the plants or trees around them. I think that for far too long, trees were perceived as something that could be added or removed, sacrificed for real estate developments. And as you said, we are reversing the approach, changing the priorities, adjusting the buildings to the trees which were there before those buildings, trees or plants. So I think that is very important to reverse these priorities. And we are seeing, I think, such a change in priorities at the moment between the relationship that necessarily exists between the mineral and vegetal environment. So I'm delighted to be welcoming you here, hosting you here for this event in Bordeaux. The local officials and representatives of World Heritage Cities, I'd like to thank the local experts who are present here and who are preparing for the future of our local territories. I'd also like to greet very particularly Michael Detis. Where is he? I can't see him. Michael Detis, I'm delighted to be welcoming you here in Bordeaux. General Secretary of the Organization of World Heritage Cities, which made this event possible, and with whom I share the ambition for the future of our cities. Our work together is a way of thinking together and in very practical terms about how we adapt our old cities to the challenges of climate change. We are all very strongly attached to our heritage, but we also need to find concrete, practical solutions so that our cities we can live in the future. In Bordeaux, we recently decided to have a grassroots initiative on the climate emergency. We have 100 people who have been working very, very seriously, along with experts, over the weekends for the past 4 months, working very intensely, bringing in advice from experts. And 3 weeks ago, they handed in a very complete report. And if I can just mention some of the points they make in that report on our subject here today, we prefer to live in a city that is livable and green, rather than in a listed city which is impossible to live in. The architectural demands should not be barriers or obstacles to greening, which is a source of quality of life, social ties, and biodiversity. So, although this is said in a very severe way, our citizens would agree with what we're saying here. So the city of Bordeaux, therefore, has been working since 2022 and working enthusiastically in the working group of the World Heritage Listed Cities to have a fresh take on our heritage and to come up with new projects, urbanism projects for our World Heritage Cities. This demands that we act and adapt our ancient cities. Very often, all too often, heritage is perceived as being an obstacle to change. And in our common approach, heritage is an asset and a driver to create and shape projects so the existing environment can contribute to our resilience. How can we make this more practical, more concrete, and work on this together? I have previously been with mayors of the World Heritage Cities, or I was with them in September 2022 in Quebec, when we approved the roadmap, the Quebec Roadmap, at the last World Congress. And today we are starting a new stage. This is the moment to pool our expertise and to develop adapted urban approaches that are adapted to the climate, social, and economic crisis. And I think two challenges are essential. First, that of making greater use of renewable energies, and also that of enabling people to profit fully from nature in their cities. I'm delighted that the working meeting that on the 5th and 6th of March in Belgium, there was a meeting of experts and companies working on a guide of good practices on photovoltaic facilities, and I hope that these guidelines will enable us to move forward more quickly in Bordeaux. We have a document to facilitate the installation of panels. Sorry, we're working on a document, I should say, to facilitate the installation of solar panels, which, so that document is currently being drafted. We want to make the city of Bordeaux a heritage city, as you know, but also a pilot in promoting solar energy. We've started doing this on some of the iconic buildings of the city, like the submarine base, where there are 25,000 square meters. And we have just launched a call for expressions of interest to install panels on a large part of that roof. Until now, we were always told that it wasn't possible, that it's a listed building. But it might not have been possible in the past, but it has become possible thanks to close collaboration between the departments of the city and working with the official architects of the Bâtiment de France, by working together between the municipal services and the state departments. I also wanted our city to contribute to thinking on how we enhance the place of nature in our cities to cool them down and make them more livable. Bordeaux, Port of the Moon, is seen as a stone city, a city of stone, and it's true that often vegetation isn't present in the different developments or in the blocks of buildings or even in private gardens. And today the quality of life in the city is increasingly threatened by climate change. In Bordeaux, like elsewhere, we have had problems of very severe heat waves, which have been a concern. To give you an example, the temperature in Bordeaux has reached 42 degrees on the 18th of July 2022, when the previous record was in 2019 with 41.6 degrees. So to respond to this urgent situation, we extended the opening hours of parks and swimming pools to allow people access to cool places, and also gave the public free access to air-conditioned places like museums and libraries to get away from the heat during these heat waves. So in addition to the one-off corrective action like this, we also need to put nature back into our public spaces and to connect to have a green network in the city with green corridors of biodiversity to cool down the environment. We've been working on this green network for 3 years with the Urba agency, and we now have a plan to guide us in practical terms, to guide our plantation efforts in public spaces, to also encourage local citizens to plant in the streets in front of their homes, and also with property developers to get them to green our public spaces. Our documents also define the spaces where there is a lack of greenery to help us to make some one-off purchases of plots of land to create small squares with vegetation. In the Bordeaux metropolitan area, there's a very ambitious plan to plant trees, which is currently being implemented. And we also have a program called Bordeaux Métropole, Cool Bordeaux Métropole, which is currently being drafted to enhance this strategy in the field. I know some of you have already talked about this in the webinars that were organized since September to share our experience. And I will conclude by thanking all of you, all those who have already contributed to the work on these subjects, to the participants, and also to the cities in the collaborative network working with Bordeaux, Puebla, Riga, Krakow, Budapest, Luxembourg, Brussels, Bruges, Héroïsme, Quebec, and the French cities which have also joined in, Lyon and Nice, who I would like to thank sincerely for working with us today. And tomorrow you will have an opportunity to discover some concrete examples of different situations from different periods, to testify to different ways in which nature has been integrated into our cities in the past. You'll see some spaces where work is currently ongoing, and to provide an initial response which can be debated together tomorrow. After that, this can contribute to our joint thinking at the next World Congress of the World Heritage Cities in Cordoba in September 2024. Thank you very much once again for your contributions, and I would like to wish all our guests a very pleasant stay here in Bordeaux. And I also wish you all a very fruitful 2 days of work, and hope that this heritage city of Bordeaux will inspire you in your discussions and in your ideas. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, and elected officials and colleagues, I'm very happy to be here in Bordeaux with you. I haven't been here for a long time. I have some very old friends here in the city, and I hope over the last couple of years that I've made some new friends here in Bordeaux. It's my hope anyway. So this is an important time for us at VPM. I'm with my colleague Emily, and my colleagues from the consulting group, from Canyon Group and Bernard Bouzou. The consulting group is responsible for the preparation of the Cordoue Symposium that will be taking place soon, and this workshop is part of the decision-making process that was the decisions that were made only 10 months ago in Quebec. Oh, sorry, 18 months ago in Quebec. We say only 18 months, but in fact, what has been done in that period. So a straight line, perhaps Anne-Laure wouldn't be entirely in agreement that it's a straight line, because there's been a lot of work and a lot of energy spent on finding the best way to apply this roadmap that was defined in Quebec. And Bordeaux has been more than a simple partner, but a true ally in this process. So I'd like to thank you for that. So, Mr. Mayor, since your declarations that you made in Quebec in 2022, that really did bring us into this adventure, well, since then, there has been a great deal that has been done and achieved. Bordeaux was this first pilot city that developed this collaborative network, and is today, with the launch of this first international workshop, organized in this road in alignment with this roadmap. So this is a workshop that is bringing together the results from the work that we've been doing, and the results will be very much at the heart of the Cordoue Symposium. So this is a very important step for us. The collaborative network has also developed and produced new possibilities for plans, and also how to overcome many of the different obstacles that we encounter in these projects. So looking at the results of these the works that have been done with other networks, we already have orientations and roadmaps that are being defined, and they appear very promising. But once again, working on this Quebec plan, there's ambitions, political ambitions, ambitions that have been expressed through the different challenges that all of the mayors agreed upon, the way in which we work, the way we learn together. This is new as well. We're not there yet, but we're making a great deal of effort into this, and the way we work together, reflection together, and looking at 12 collaborative networks that will be developed or are being developed. So this is no less than 25 cities that are members, or towns that are members of this road map. And so 30 towns that are supporting through the collaborative network. So it's almost half of the members of the organization that are now tangibly involved in this process. So the closer we get to Cordoue, the more there will be mobilization on the part of the network and the towns as well. So I think it would appear that we're going in the right direction. So with your help and your contribution from this workshop this week, we will be developing new perspectives for the symposium. So the Cordoue Symposium will not be a final point itself, but it's a step, it's a stage. And we can see the work that you will have done, and we'll be validating the idea of habitability. And habitability is, for me, the great victory of what we've done so far already, because habitability is confirmed as being the common denominator across all of these different collaborative networks. And this shared aspiration to achieve this and this new urban project with capital letters, and the VPN wants to be working on. So the results of your work will help in Cordoue in convincing all of our members that it is possible to manage the challenges of climate change with a heritage approach and urban adaptation with the focus on habitability, habitats and inhabitants. And all of this has consequences that we are beginning to see more clearly and clarify, and we are ready to take these on. So therefore, Cordoue will be a ramp to a newer stage, shall we say, and we really do hope all of the different organizations join us in this program, and also defining our methodology, which is quite audacious, will also, and we've been testing it these last months, we continue to test this methodology, and this will give us new perspectives and give our members new perspectives, and we very much hope to convince them of this. And this will also lead to the emergence of new responsibilities, wider responsibilities for the VPM organization, the World Heritage Cities and Towns organization. So this is changing as well. This organization of heritage cities is also evolving with these new needs. And we've also been approaching the slogan, doing more, doing it better, faster for our towns, with you, with your example and your engagement. So thank you very much to Bordeaux once again and all of the different departments involved in this, and to the towns that are collaborating in this network and who are here with us today. So I do hope we have a very productive symposium over the next 2 days. Thank you. So, hello everybody. Can you hear me clearly? Not very well, okay. Is it okay? Can you hear me now? Is the sound okay? So, hello. I work at the agency for town planning here in Bordeaux. It was created in 1969 when the Bordeaux metropolitan area was created. It was the same time, so we accompany these public policies. And it's with great pleasure that we are running this work session. And we have 3 people who will be joining us and speaking today who have different, what appear to be different approaches. And this is what we're going to test with them today. Of course. So before we get started, perhaps we'll just a few words, introductory words of our panel. So perhaps Manola Antonioli, we'll start with you. Yes, can you hear me okay with the microphone? So I am a philosopher and a teacher at the Architectural School of Paris La Villette, and I work in a research team at La Villette, therefore, that is an anthropological laboratory and an architectural laboratory that's worked with Bordeaux and the Bordeaux metropolitan area on different research projects. And I also run a research program on ecosophy at the International School of Philosophy. And I have a fairly heterogeneous background because I work in contemporary philosophy, theories of space design, and architecture as well. So you'll explain what the hell that means. Rémi SALLES. Hello? Can you hear me okay? Louder. So I'm a landscaper and garden designer, landscape designer here in Bordeaux and in Dublin. I've spent a large proportion of my life in urban areas, particularly in heritage cities, including Bordeaux, Paris, Lyon, and Dublin. I was trained in Paris at the Superior School of Landscaping in Paris. Then I worked with Michel Deligne. I went to Dublin in 2003, and I spent 6 years there, a period during which I taught at the University College Dublin, and I created my first agency as well in Dublin. And so I've been in the area now for about 15 years, and we work on projects on varying scales, different scales. So, for example, in Bordeaux, we're working on the 1 million tree plan, which is the name of one of the contracts, and also the Bastide Niel neighborhood quarter, the other side of the river, since 2014. And we have recently been chosen to work with the AM team to define the new centre, Bordeaux Centre, historic centre. And we've also worked a great deal on the Art Deco neighborhood in Pau. And we're very interested in phytosociology, so we'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail as we go along. And now we will conclude with Eric LARREY. So hello, everybody. Eric LARREY. I am a engineering group that works on Bordeaux metropolitan area a lot. And we work on very practical aspects of town planning and works, greening. And I am responsible for research and innovation within this group, in this engineering group. I hope I'm loud enough. That wasn't loud enough there. Okay. So I'm responsible for research and innovation, and for the last 5 years, there's been a very important theme that we've been working on, both in Bordeaux metropolis, but not only, and this is of nature in town and the way this happens, its behavior, and what this can bring ecosystemically to the population. And one of the angles through which, or one of the prisms through which we look at nature in urban environments is through cooling, of course, temperature reduction, because from the spring through to September, October, over the last few years, heat and heat waves in urban areas has become a real challenge. It's perceptible by everybody, even if the role of nature in urban areas has more roles than simply temperature. Don't tell them everything yet. Let's not give it all away straight away. It's very important to say that it's not just a question of temperatures and heat, but it is a critical question, of course. So, well, thank you very much indeed. And we have an engineer, a philosopher, and a landscaper. So to give them a challenge, I've asked them to prepare a question for another one of them. And of course, a question with a trap. And you as well, feel free to ask questions and give us your perspectives. So don't hesitate to challenge them in their fields of expertise. And the aim here is to answer this question. Because this roundtable should be answering a question. It is the purpose of our roundtable. Greening to reduce the temperature in a heritage town. So greening to cool. And if I clearly read the first page, we are expected to provide elements that are both in terms of the challenges, the importance of this question, of these historical centers, but also in terms of vision, experience, methods, and why not? We did evoke this. I'm trying to find some simple shared principles to develop a new project for these heritage cities. So we'll be very interested to hear what you do have to say on this question. There's 3 questions, in fact: challenges, methods, principles. And therefore, the first thing we'll be doing is starting with you, Eric, because I want to ask you as an engineer, so that you incarnate, shall we say, you represent the objective perspectives of fact analysis, even if we will see that you have many other facets in your expertise and personality, of course. But what could you say to us on the question of heat and heat waves in towns, and how planting is important? How can we diagnostics and interpretation? And of course, we'll be asking you regarding Bordeaux or other metropolitan areas. What can we say? What can we say objectively that helps us to understand the challenges and what can be done? And notably, and you explained this to us, but you invented an index that won an award, if I'm not mistaken. So perhaps you could say a few words. Take your time and explain all of this, please. Very good. Well, so let me introduce this to you. So we did prepare some slides for you, some visual supports here to explain what we do and why we do it. So yes, we did work with Bordeaux Metropolis over a few years in elaborating and developing methodologies to observe the city, irrespective of the individual site, but there's always a diagnostic phase. So we don't stop at the diagnostic phase, of course. And what's interesting is how do we then use this data? How can we use this information to act? But we need to start with collecting this data. So this first image that you can see here is a view of Bordeaux and with the tool that we developed. So this is in terms of user and thermal comfort. And throughout our discussion, the user is the inhabitant. It's the person that lives there, uses public spaces, tourists, people who visit the town itself. And what it's a question here of seeing how, as they evolve through the seasons, through the days, how do they experience this thermal comfort? So this first image that you can see here on the screen, this is a view, a perspective of the city and where we could see these urban heat islands. And so perhaps we can now move on to the next slide. And this is to share this information with you because everybody knows what urban temperature and urban coolness is, but the terminology itself changes. So the terminology that we'll be using is dissociating the idea of singular urban heat islands and plural urban heat islands. That might appear semantic, but there's something important behind this. So what I'm showing you, the picture in the middle shows you a cross section, and what we have is this urban heat dome. And it's always warmer in the heart of the city where there's more activity, more buildings, and the temperature reduces as you move to the suburbs and then out to the countryside. So this is a phenomenon that can be observed in the summer, but it can also actually be observed even better in the winter, because when there are freezing conditions around the city, rarely is this the case in the city. And so you could, just as a rule, it's about 4 degrees higher the temperature in the town centre than it is outside the town. And this can go very fast because even in small towns, when I talk about small towns, we're talking about much less urbanized than Bordeaux, for example, or other metropolitan areas. I live in Lyon, for example, in Lyon, and that's very clear there. But even towns as small as 30,000 people, as soon as you leave the town centre, then you can feel a significant reduction in temperature. So this is very important to recognise, because human activity, concentration of buildings, of different human activities, does create this heat dome. And it's not in itself useful to know this, because it doesn't actually guide you in landscaping. So then the question is the plural of these zones, these islands. And therefore, they are generally warmer during the day than they are at night. So this doesn't mean that a heat island is always warmer than everywhere else, but these are zones that have this ability to store energy and then restitute it at night. So then you're going to have discomfort at night as well. So what you can see here, this is a zoom into the map of Bordeaux here, that you could see the other aspect is, and in our engineer's vision and approach, which can at times appear a bit strange, because we do have this need to have objective results. It's not just engineers who have this. When we talk about heat, we need to talk about, we are very poor thermometers ourselves. We have very different appreciations and feeling of heat. Some people can tolerate higher temperatures and other people much less so. So the idea of too hot or not hot enough, it's not very easy to define, and therefore we need objective data. We need to have an objective view of this temperature and thermal comfort. And therefore, as you can see here, and this has been done in other areas as well, of course, and this is a question of data acquisition. This is very important indeed. It can be done in with 7 different methodologies. Sometimes you can have a network of sensors around town, around plants as well, to understand and record throughout the day the temperatures, the fluctuations, levels of humidity in the soil, in the air, also in terms of pollution levels, the wind speed. We also work on satellite data. And satellite data are extremely useful because they do allow you to cover a very large area. When you're looking at a territory the size of Bordeaux, which is a large area, but the metropolitan area is even larger, of course, we can't put sensors around the entire urban area. So therefore, we work on these larger scale images using satellite data. And then we have computational simulations as well. So these give us models, in fact, to associate local data, satellite data with physical models that will allow us to understand what's happening and why it's happening within the town itself. So this is a very important phase indeed. And then, of course, there's the question of vegetation. Urban vegetation. Often we look at this on 2 levels. So with the lower levels, so ground level vegetation, and then medium level, and then higher, which is trees, of course, and that will manage and react to temperatures differently. And the first thing that we notice in here, and very important indeed, is that needs to be taken into account in terms of all greening strategies, is water and its role, because vegetation is living. They're living systems, and therefore, because they're living, when you think about vegetalizing or greening, planting, landscaping, you need to think about water. How do you bring water? How do you water the plants themselves? And how can they have some level of independence as well? Otherwise, your project is a non-starter, of course. So there's an image you can see here. So this is a map of the canopy, the tree canopy over Bordeaux. And this is right next to us. In fact, it's the Place des Quinconces, which is just next to where we are right now. And if we look at this image, you get the impression, and you look at the trees and the shadow, and so I plant, therefore I have shade, and therefore it's cooler. That's not the case. It's not true, because trees cool through evapotranspiration. In fact, they will vaporize through the water, and this is what makes it cooling. But this only works if they have access to water, of course, because now if you look at this map below, you can see the cartography here with the map, the trees that the city looks after, the metropolitan area looks after, and each spot is a tree. And what we've done is we've looked at their hydric stress, their drought stress, sorry, and we can see the drought stress of each individual tree. And what we can see here on this map is that all trees are not subject to the same conditions. In fact, there are some tree areas or planted areas in darker blue here, As you can well imagine, darker it is, the more water they have. So there it's functioning well. And where it's red, it's problematic and then don't have water. It doesn't mean they're dying, but what it means is they're not doing this gaseous exchange. They're no longer carrying, there's no longer this evaporation, and there's no photosynthesis either. And this is probably what's the most important, because this is where we transform CO2 into oxygen, and this is absolutely fundamental for the city, for the town. But if it's warm, if we're not producing this, then we are missing out on the benefits of the trees themselves. And therefore, a tree that does not this actually means the tree stops growing. You have trees that stop growing because of the drought stress, and you can see on some specific sites, less so in Bordeaux, there's almost no tree growth whatsoever. And this can become a very delicate question, a very serious question, when you're faced with climate change and you're looking at changes in rainfall levels. And when you do have droughts, which can start in March and go through to October, here, this is a real problem. May and June, this is when trees grow. And if they're not getting water, they're not growing, they're not developing. And the question is, how long can a tree live without water before it dies? You see trees that have brown branches, the rest is green. So this is what's called a partial embolism, emboly. And so they've got branches that have died. You can have the entire tree that dies as well. And this, of course, is a living being that's disappearing from the urban environment. So we're on now the next question. This is another vision, another perspective we have, and this is perhaps more important for our landscapers and our philosophers. But this is very relevant. The question: Can we transform all our heat islands? Well, no, often the question is quite simply, no, we can't. It's not always possible to get rid of every heat island. The heat's there, the area's there, the challenges are there, there perhaps aren't the right trees or they can't be planted. And what we can say is that there's a problem. But there is another solution. We need to give people keep people access to close vegetation, to green areas. So what we call this 300 meters or 5 minutes of walking slowly. If you're working with a small child who's just learned how to walk, or an elderly person, in 5 minutes you can do 300 meters. And the idea is to have these landscaped areas, these green areas, close to these heat islands. So it's very hot where I am, but I can easily get to a park, for example. And there are other aspects. There are clinical studies that also show that people's health is different when they are closer to greenery and plants than not. And it also facilitates, it does promote people walking. So normally this is a reflex that is not natural, shall we say. So these are not public spaces here, but each space, each habitation, etc. We've looked within this 300-meter radius, and this defines zones where you're lacking green areas, park spaces. And this is extremely important from our perspective, and for different territories as well, to associate this with the idea of heat islands. And therefore, there are two elements of environmental exposure, shall we say. We've got this discomfort, this heat discomfort, and the possibility of having access to parks or greenery very nearby. Please don't hesitate to jump in if there's anything you'd like to add to what I'm saying. That's very interesting indeed. So now, across all of these elements, in terms of drought, stress, vegetation, density of vegetation, mineral, ground covering, etc. And this will have a very strong impact on people's comfort and their heat, their thermal comfort. So this shows these different zones. You can see the red zones here, which really are heat islands. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's the hottest spots at any given time, but they have all of the capacity to store heat, and they have no ability to dissipate this heat, or to, for example, provide canopy cover to reduce direct sunlight. So we really have looked at this in terms of the user's comfort, and this is the result of a lot of different data that's been collected, and not only in Bordeaux, but across other urban sites with these physical models, and this has then been mapped across this entire territory, like all of Bordeaux metropolitan area. We've done the same thing to Paris, and the 3 communes around Paris as well. So it's a very useful tool to have a very quick vision of these specific areas where there are heat islands, where there is a challenge in terms of drought conditions for plants and trees. And then we cross-reference this with the access to green areas as well. So on the next slide now, in addition to this notion, therefore, there's this idea of mapping of these heat islands. It provides a lot of information, and now we're going to look at something more practical. So what do I do? How do we actually react to this or act on this? And so there's another index, and this is inhabited exposure. So each building, each habitation, we will be cross-referencing 2 types of information, how access to greenery and heat islands. And this is more simple but more complete, in fact, because there are 5 different levels of exposure. So you can see the very high exposure areas where there's a lot of heat islands and not green and very few green spaces. Others where they might not be heat island areas, but there's no greenery, and other areas where very comfortable. I'm not in a heat island, and I have greenery around me as well. And this really is what drives our greening activities. One of the aims here is to perhaps say all of these most exposed sites, just to bring them down 1 level. So level 5s, moving them towards level 4s. And this is an important point that you mentioned, in fact. What about towns that are very dense indeed, and with heritage sites as well? This is the case in Bordeaux, in Lyon, in Strasbourg, Paris. And we will find these very concentrated urban areas where there's a lack of greenery, and there's heat islands in historical centres where there's very dense buildings and not necessarily a lot of space that is available for planting and greening. Just to give you an example, it's not Bordeaux, but it's quite symptomatic. You take the second arrondissement, the second quarter of Paris. This is a real heat island. 62% of the zone is built. 62% is built up. You've got some roads, etc. This leaves very, very little space for greenery. And the question is, what do you do in an area like this? No territory that we're working in has a strategy, but this has been mentioned in meetings with elected officials. The only thing you do is knock down buildings. This isn't something we're doing, but the question is, there's no space left, so what do? You actually replace buildings with greenery again. So you do need to provide access to green areas, to parks, and this really does bring us into the next phase of our project and how we work. So the first interface you're looking at here is the difference between heat islands and the perceived temperature, how the temperature feels like. And so what you can see here, you've got this index of user comfort, and then you've got the perceived temperature at midday in July in 2023. In this case, these maps we're doing with the greenery of last year. So you can see the difference here. The colors were chosen quite deliberately, so they're very visible. And what you can see here is at 2 p.m., these small, narrow streets, which often are east-west oriented, high buildings, they're in the shade. So if you walk through them, it's not so, it feels less warm. Doesn't mean that area can't store heat, but it does at that given time, it can be a little bit more comfortable than in a north-south facing street or in an open area. So this is important. Next slide, please. And here's another aspect, and this is the perceived temperature is also dependent on numerous elements: the temperature, sunlight, humidity, and wind, of course. And less so in terms of heat, but the air circulation in streets does contribute to comfort. If there is good air circulation, the air is renewed, the hot air is not stagnating, but it's moving. And this has also an impact on pollution, of course. If there's good air circulation, it can bring pollution, but as a rule as well, it will also renew the air faster as well. So on the simulation here, you can see air circulation on the user level with the directions of different wind. Wind can come from different areas, but there are 16 main directions of wind direction. And you can see how this impacts perceived comfort. And in Bordeaux, in the summer generally, you have westerly winds, northwesterly and southwesterly winds. And this gives us a criteria for the ventilation or the air circulation of these streets, which brings us to the next slide, which is these. So we've got our heat islands, we've got our perceived temperatures. This can be a guide in terms of creating these areas where there is greenery, less heat, and also people can comfortably access areas of greenery. And what's important here is, in terms of these different multimodal means of transport, is being able to access these green areas in comfortable pathways. So this was another index or indicator that we created, and this is based on heat, comfort, vegetation, air circulation, and the perceived temperature, notably during the hours of the day when the temperatures are the highest. And so therefore this gives us this fairly simple map for all of the different roadways, and it shows where there are continuous pathways that are comfortable, where we can say, okay, I can take this route and I won't go through any heat islands, or there are potentially even greener areas. And this, therefore, leads us to informs our greening strategy, because we can create cooler zones that are equally spread out across the territory, that will allow access to all the population within 300 meters, and will create these spaces in different types of surfaces. It doesn't need to be large surfaces, it could be a small square. And then we have this idea of users, a small greened square where somebody can go sit and read, for example, or have a bite to eat at lunchtime. It's very good indeed. We can have some children's play areas, workout spaces for sporting activities, or you can actually have a park. All of these different zones can be taken into account, and this is then associated with a network of comfortable pathways that allow people to move from zone to zone, whether it be on foot, scooters, bicycles, to allow people to move around these different areas comfortably, and ensuring that most of the inhabited spaces do provide access to cooler areas, greener areas, and with a fairly comfortable route to get to them. So now, we've been looking so far at facts, shall we say, or from the engineer's perspective, but then, of course, we're not robots, of course, we don't have blinkers on, and what we see then is we always we look at this from the perspective of the user, and we try to be as objective as we can in terms of temperature, shadow, etc. But when we speak to people in the streets, when we ask people, and this is something we do, we go and we speak to users, how they perceive the public spaces. And what we very quickly saw was that the perception of a public space goes way beyond the question of simply cooling. We can have spaces which are actually quite warm or hot, but are appreciated. And we also have other spaces which are cooler, but they're not appreciated. And the questions here that come up are that, just to give you some criteria, it can be very often be questions of security, safety. Is this a safe area? And I'd say that the question of safety and security is very important, of course, and often it can be very localized. And this means that in some towns, when you come from an urban area, larger urban area, we're not saying that all of the large cities are more dangerous than villages, but there's generally more interaction between inhabitants, which can lead to more problems. And we can see in smaller towns, this idea of insecurity is very important indeed, and then our external judgment has no value whatsoever. It's what's important is how people feel who live there. So what we need to take into account here, beyond the factual aspects, it can be attractiveness, it could be the different use case scenarios. You could have a space that's not necessarily very comfortable, but there are some elements. I'm thinking, for example, about a specific example in the town of Caen in the north of France, where there's a commemoration square, which is for the D-Day, and people are very, very attached to this space, and they don't want that square to become completely changed and for it no longer be able to have these memorials. So there are all of these things that need to be taken into account as well. This vision, the way in which people perceive these spaces, what are their expectations in terms of uses? This is absolutely fundamental, because if you're landscaping and planning a new area, if it's not accepted by the population, then it's going to be a failure. So so this element of consultation is very important. We don't just impose this. So it's a question of design thinking, co-creation, and it's not marketing. It is a reality. To do things properly, you do need to take into account inhabitants, of course. And there's objective ideas can also showing people, because these tools are simulation tools, so therefore we can add vegetation, we can take buildings out, add buildings in, we can objectively say this is what will happen when it's done, this is what it'll look like, and this can be very useful, very important, because explaining to the population we're not going to do anything about this heat island is very difficult for people to accept. But if you say, objectively speaking, we can't do anything about this because we can't plant trees here because it won't work, because they won't have enough water, but creating a cooler zone here to which you have very nearby access and show people the objective benefits of this really can bring people on board. And just finishing on this and concluding with this, the challenge that we're very often confronted with is that it could be difficult to have a gentle or a serene discussion on this question. When we talk about environment, vegetalizing, greening, destruction, etc., it can very quickly become extremely emotional and problematic and actually become quite violent. So it's important. So back to your conclusion regarding having objective facts regarding heat, etc. The ability to confront these things versus practices. Coming back to this question, this very important question, how do we do this in terms of action and this with people's usage, cultures, and the reality of heat? Just a quick question, a very local question. What can you say regarding what's unique about Bordeaux, what's specific to Bordeaux and its heritage sites and streets, its narrow streets, and what's unique or specific to the Bordeaux challenge? And perhaps also in terms of what can be done, what's being done, and to make it, and also with public and private spaces, because there's a lot more interventions here. We're talking about public spaces, but what about the different situations with heat and shall we say private heat islands as opposed to public heat islands, and what's possible there, and what public action is possible in this scenario?
Okay, one thing I could mention is that generally what local authorities want to know is how their city compares with others. And this is a point which is important. Is my city okay? Am I doing things right? Do I need to do anything? And we have worked on several hundreds of French towns, cities, several abroad also, trying to identify trends. And one trend that is interesting is looking at the surface area of green spaces that are accessible per inhabited compared to the surface area. So in Paris, you have 27,000 inhabitants per square kilometers. So they have a limited area each for each inhabitant. But in these hundreds of towns all over the country, they always lie between two curves. One is a sort of maximum in terms of density per inhabitant per square kilometer, and none of the cities exceed that figure, because objectively in the field we've never found a town so dense that there was no longer the green spaces. So I don't know, if we imagine if you have 7,000 inhabitants per square kilometer and you want 250 square meters of green space per inhabitant, there isn't a single city in France which reaches that figure. However, if we look at inhabitants between 3,000 and 7,000 people per square kilometer, there's a huge dispersal of the figures. So for a given density, you can easily find towns or cities in identical areas. Obviously, we can't necessarily compare the south and the north, but in the local territory, there can be towns with the same density, but which have twice the surface area of green spaces of others. And that's also why it's interesting to have these different towns and cities, so you can look at what you are doing in your town or city, or in others in an identical context, And the objective, to come back to your questions, is that ultimately there's not just trees, there's all kinds of vegetation at ground level, on walls, on roofs. So all the vegetation in the town or city can play a part. Obviously, it's not easy to have green walls on historic buildings. I don't have any examples of that I can give you. But the notion of protection also needs to evolve in the light of the actual demands and of climate change. So the first thing we can say is if we look at these figures, the city of Bordeaux, compared with the other big metropolises in France, isn't all that bad. There are places which are far worse. Paris, Marseille, in terms of the density of heat islands. There are metropolitan areas which are slightly smaller, like Grenoble, which is also known for its mineral aspect and its high density of heat islands. Then there are places which are far more greenery, but what you have to be careful. We calculate this rate of vegetation to the land area. If you take a city like Nîmes, Arles, or Aix-en-Provence, or Marseille, you have huge land areas with large parks. But what's interesting is to look actually at the urban area. If you have a huge area and you take account of all the agriculture around it, you get good figures. So the city in itself, Bordeaux, ranks quite well in terms of vegetation and heat islands. The issue of historic city centres is always the same. If we take Bordeaux and Lyon, where I live, in Lyon you have a peninsula in the middle between the Rhône and Saône rivers, and this is one of the most mineral areas in the Lyon metropolitan area. It's Haussmann 18th century Lyon-style buildings, stone-built buildings with 5 stories, very dense, one of the densest areas in France. But you have very, very little vegetation per inhabitant. But what's interesting when you look at this, and this is something we just mentioned earlier, there's the question of inequality, which is very frequent, which comes up. The subject is obviously very touchy, this social and environmental inequality. So do the zones where we have the most deprived populations, are these the zones which have the biggest impact of heat islands? Last year there was an article in Mediapart which said that rich people were taking ownership of the green spaces in cities in Paris, in Marseille, Lyon to a lesser extent. And this question in metropolitan areas, generally, the answer to this generally is no. In most of the metropolitan areas in France, that's not where you have the biggest inequalities. Obviously, we know that the price of property increases if you have buildings, pleasant buildings facing onto a park. The price per square meter will be higher, so that's going to tend to be higher social classes, wealthier social classes. But there are lots of 1970s property developments which may not be the sort of place people dream of living in, but which have lots of green spaces around them all the same. So you don't necessarily have the same inequality that we do find in metropolitan areas where there has been a sort of pauperization of the city centre. Often former industrial cities. I was born in Roubaix, in the north, one of these towns which has suffered a lot from deindustrialization. But when you look at the environmental and social inequality in the heart of Roubaix, the center of the town has become much poorer, which is not the case of that peninsula in the center of Lyon or of the center of Bordeaux. So the situation is not quite the same. So I've perhaps got off the subject, I'm afraid. And what about Bordeaux then? So my question was really about Bordeaux. This point is important because from one city to another, we have between 40 and 60% of the space in the city which is private. And when an urban authority wants to act to cool down the city, but it perhaps has control over 40, 50 or 60% of the territory, and and half is private, it's difficult. So it's necessary, in fact, to involve private owners in the process. There will be big property development companies, and then there'll be individual homes. Sharing the garden of our own home obviously is going to be something that's complicated to arrange. But seeing that there are public spaces in schoolyards, for example, there is genuine thinking going on. 5 years ago, this was something which was completely impossible to consider. The subject couldn't even be brought up. But today, saying that if we look at the territory that's accessible, the land accessible in our city centre, there are public spaces where I could do greening in school yards with the different local authorities. These spaces are not used during the holidays and sometimes aren't used in the evening. And that can also be an issue. But now we have municipalities who are thinking about opening up these spaces, because objectively, if we look at the local territory, we don't have any other solutions. Then there are other things also being looked at, and I think this is important. There's more and more openness to this sort of idea that perhaps we have to ease certain rules, as the mayor said earlier. If people prefer to have a cool city, a city where the temperature is cooler rather than a heritage city, if you have a very hot tourist site and nobody wants to go there, what's the point? So we have to find tailored, adapted solutions, and we work with historians on development projects to know what has been done in the past. In Lyon, there was a greening project for Place Bellecour, the big Bellecour Square in the center of Lyon. And when we look back to the past, there was much more greenery on that square in the past. Do our two other speakers have any questions to try to catch out our speaker? I don't have a difficult question, but there is a question that comes to mind, which is that for me, the key question I really wanted to ask, I was thinking of keeping it for the end, but I can ask it now. It's not even a trap, this question. It's just something that came to mind when I was listening to you, is how do you reconcile, if I can say, or how do you combine the technical objective notions of your work as an engineer, and what we might call the notions. So how do you combine this with other notions? In the city there are lots of people, and there are statistics, graphs, pie charts that we can use, and at the same time you said you have to take account of the experience, the feeling for the user. So how do you reconcile these things? Because there's also the question of the language that comes into, we have a lot of terms that come from marketing, which are used in people's thinking on these ideas. And I think that can be very destructive for the psychological environment. So you talk about the user. So the people who live in cities aren't users, they're citizens. It's not somebody who has access to services. A city isn't just a set of services. So I was wondering whether it might not be interesting to use a term other than user experience, which comes from sort of economics and marketing. And when we have our mineral cities, as you mentioned, quite simply, these mineral cities might just be the consequence of a certain economic model, a certain way in which cities were designed. And if we want to address this, so that was the question I had. The other question, the other issue for me is the term of our perception. You talked, or feeling or perception. For me, perception, philosophically, I understand, but when you're talking, perception is something which is used widely in the media. It's like mental or societal. I'm not sure exactly why we use suddenly societal rather than social. Perhaps it sounds a bit more managerial or a bit more, or perhaps because there are political or other issues which are disturbing here. So here, when you talk about can we not talk more about the perception than about the experience? And another term which poses a problem politically for me is when you say that we need to, when we have to take account of the feeling of insecurity of people. As you know, this is something which is being much used by the right and far right at the moment. So I don't think we really should go in that direction. We can perhaps assess things which are objectively accessible, even if people do have these perceptions, because in recent years they're constantly hearing these totally wild, over-the-top speeches about the homeless, immigrants, insecurity and things like that, who are going to kill their children or rape their wives. That's quite a long question, if I may say so. But there was a long presentation there, so I have a long question. I'm not sure if that might not be the philosopher's opinion that you're expressing there. I'm not sure it's possible to answer, but on this question of the experience or perception and of the objective nature of this, how can the engineer and novelist at the same time, who does have a heart despite being an engineer, how does he reconcile these things which cannot be reconciled? I think all engineers have a heart, you know. I think. But even if we don't have a heart, we do live in cities. We are users of cities. And so, like everybody, we are impacted by these subjects. I don't know if I'm going to answer in the order in which the questions were asked. And you did mention some concepts I wasn't aware of. The right to the city, the production of space. These are urban sociology works which are very important. And they say that space, there are three visions of space. There is the space projected by the developers, the public authorities, but the space can also be experienced by the people who live there, and the urban experience, and one should not prevail necessarily over the other or dominate the other. I perhaps am lacking philosophical culture, and I have no engineering culture, so that doesn't help. But on questions of the perception or the experience, I have no problem with that. I may have used terms which, from your point of view, are perhaps not the most suited. But it's difficult to take account of everything, no matter what the subject. The more parameters that we have, the more complicated it gets, and there does come a point where perhaps you need to have a defeatist but realistic approach, that we can't take account of all the issues. And vegetation or greening is not the answer to all the problems. Sometimes we have the impression that through this policy of greening, we're going to resolve a lot of problems, but there can still be a lot of issues. Just to give you some very practical examples in terms of this notion of insecurity. We have never wanted, in fact, there isn't an insecurity issue linked to certain types of population. When we're working in development, property development, there will be issues that come up, the question of light. We're going to be asked about sites. In the evening, if you have a square which doesn't have lighting, the population are going to say, I don't want to go there because there's no light, there's no lighting, so there's going to be a risk. And that's not targeting a specific population group. So we work with a lighting specialist or landscape specialist to try to have that light in the evening. Another aspect which very much marked me is when I worked on developing a square, for example, with good greening. But when we did surveys in the field among the population with different samples, several hundreds of people from the local population, the feedback was that roughly half the population didn't want really to go on that square. It was nicely laid out, well, with lots of greenery. But the part of the population that wasn't wanting to go there was the women. The way it had been developed made it that people felt that when they were there, they couldn't be seen from the outside. So if there was a danger there, nobody would realize. Obviously, we have no statistics to say whether there are more or fewer assaults after the development. But after the square had been redesigned, women did not want to go there. And I give the example because for us it was really striking. And we said to ourselves, if we're not taking account of this sort of thing, we're really missing out on some important issues. Thank you very much. A question from Rémi, and then we have a question from the room. I have some questions which link in with what I'm going to be presenting later, but still, I will ask them anyway. With the maps we saw of Bordeaux, they're taken from data in 2023. Can you hear me okay? Speak more clearly. In 2023, we see that there is a change, a trend towards periods of time which are hotter and hotter, especially in summer. And we also see that part of the greenery is suffering. And vegetation doesn't suffer when it has water and can do its evapotranspiration. But in the future, if the climate does get hotter, the quantity of water will become less and there'll be more of an issue. So have you prepared for all of this? Have you gone further with your measurements to try to prepare for this future risk? I'll try to answer this. We did an initial study on 1 million trees to try to analyze the trend in water between 2021 and 2022, one which was cool and damp and the other which was hot and dry, and those 1 million urban trees all over France from Toulouse to Brussels, and we studied the behavior, how the different species of tree responded to the conditions in 2021 and 2022. And in Bordeaux, there are slightly over 600 different species of trees or plants, and we want to see, depending on where they're planted, whether they're planted alone or with other plants around them, what happens with their level of stress. And this gives us an indicator, species by species, to say, okay, this species, even in a very hot summer, there'll only be 20% of the population which will really experience severe stress. Whereas in another species, it might be 80% of the individuals, which suggests that perhaps that species is not the best one to choose for a given place. So this data from Bordeaux or Toulouse is interesting also for the cities of the north to see how they can prepare. So what I did is I contacted the people in charge of trees in Madrid and Valencia to say it would be interesting to do the same study on trees much further south, because that might well be the climate in 15 or 20 years' time in Bordeaux or here. I haven't got an answer yet, but if there are any cities here who would be interested in this, to see how these species do respond to these different conditions, to try to make forecasts. And if we want to plant trees in our cities, in the north of France, perhaps they can draw inspiration from the species used in the south of France to prepare for the changes in the climate over the next 15 years. We'll take a question from the floor. Is there a mic? Hello, Paul Trouillot, landscape architect. Thank you for that very interesting presentation about this tool to help work on heat islands in urban cities. And it's interesting to see this application of engineering principles to this sort of subject with all the questions of perception. I agree with what was said about that. There's also a notion. So it's a lot of different factors which all come into play. And the landscape architect does need the support of this sort of information in our work. But I would like to highlight the fact that nature is that there are different ranges of plants and trees. If we're looking, for example, at conifers or at deciduous trees or different layers of vegetation. So there's a lot of different factors can be taken into account. A second very important point is that of adaptation to climate change, adapting vegetation to climate change. A lot of scientific work has been done on this with different organizations. So, and we need to use this because there have been projections which have been made for the next 20 or 50 years and which come up with some very striking results. And this all needs to be taken into account. And then on the notion of cooling down the city, I'd like to emphasize the fact that we agree it's not just vegetation or greening that is going to resolve the problem. We really need to redesign whole public spaces involving greenery, but taking account also of all the different aspects of the space, taking account of local people's opinions, users, but especially the people who live in these districts, taking account of the type of soils, permeability, street lighting, all sorts of different issues. We need to have consultations, shared gardens, all sorts of different approaches to public spaces which require a multidisciplinary approach with all the different professions. And finally, you talked, landscape architects have been working on this notion of itineraries or pathways through the space for many years. So the designer of the quayside in Bordeaux at the time, I spoke to him shortly before his death, and he said the only thing he regretted was that he hadn't planted more along the quayside. So we can have density and very mineral spaces if 300 yards away or 500 yards away there are ecological corridors or itineraries with nature and with water. And so we need also to have places also which provided to enable older people to get from one space to another. So we have to rethink the whole public space. And in that case, we can propose a more bearable, more livable city centre. And the final challenge that you mentioned in your very interesting presentation is the notion of renaturing these spaces. Not greening, renaturing is the term I want to use. I won't go on much longer. Thank you very much. Thank you to you, which provides the perfect transition to the next presentation. Thank you, Eric, for the very interesting presentation and for the contribution to this debate. And now we're going to move on to a landscape designer's view, changing profession, with Rémi SALLES, who, on the basis of his professional experience in recent times, is going to explain how he has worked on this question of heat and greenery in the southwest mainly. I don't know if we have your slideshow ready. So in terms of providing a response, so what have you done recently? What have you not been able to do that you would have liked to do? And why are there these differences between the first versions of projects and what is then actually done? For any designer, there's always a difference between what you would like to do and what ends up being done in the end. So if you could tell us about your experience and this gap between the idea and the actual project. So the main technical demands, which restrict our possibilities in terms of greening. I'll mention this very quickly because these are things that you're all familiar with, I think, but it's worth mentioning just so we have these things in mind. One of the key demands in our old heritage centres with their very narrow streets is that there are a lot of houses, and for trees we need to have space. And there's this rule of a minimum of 1.50 meters between a utility network and the tree. And so this requires a lot of work by the different contractors involved, working on behalf of the public authorities, to try to get exemptions from these rules, because 1.50 meters minimum between a utility network and a tree in historic centres makes it impossible to do any planting at all. So we have to find ways of doing this. We have to present the arguments that a tree is not just for the quality of the landscape or for its aesthetic quality, it's a question of public health. And with this argument, often the contractors can accept to move their networks, even though it's expensive. And so it's simpler, though, to see if we can get exemptions from the rules. So I think there are changes underway. There are changes moving in our favour. Discussions are underway, and it's quite promising. And then another technical demand, which is very important, is access for firefighting equipment. So in Bordeaux, for example, we have a width of 4 meters without any trees. So the fire brigade can have access to all buildings, but 4 meters is a lot. In the old heritage centre, where I think Rue Sainte-Catherine is 11 to 12 meters wide, but others are just 6 or 7 meters wide. 4 meters is a lot. So in Bastille-Niel, for example, in that district, there has been a change in the rules. And for example, there in that district, they have widened the access requirement for the fire brigades from 3 to 4 meters, which meant we had to remove 150 trees from that district. So these really are the issues. So we then have to see whether the trees can be planted to allow lighting. Also access for the removal of the containers with household waste. And so all these things have to be taken into account. The refuse trucks have to be able to get in and to have access to all this. And when you add all this together, there's not much space for planting trees. And this is an example which is actually in Bastille-Niel, a street which is 10 meters wide, where we did manage to arrange the utility networks to lay them down the center of the street, opening up spaces where we can do planting in a district like this. But obviously in an existing network, you have utility networks and piping and ducts everywhere underground, and you don't have any possibility to do any planting. So these are the technical demands. After that, another example shows us how heritage and cultural value can change a greening project. This is in the town of La Réole, a heritage centre, town centre, south-east, heading down towards Agen. Here, so there's the street here, Armand-Caduc, which is the main street in the town centre, and it's also a town of art and history. And so you see the state of the street, which was laid out in the 80s or 90s, which is now in very poor condition, catastrophic condition. And so a survey was conducted among local people to understand their perceptions, if that's the term I meant to use. So their perceptions, which was that the street was absolutely unbearable in summer because of the excessive heat. Impossible to live there. So what they wanted was for it to be cooled down considerably by any means possible. Great. So we prepared our project, trying to plant as much vegetation, but also other things, but a lot of work on greening as well as other factors. So planting trees in the middle of the street. Everybody was very happy. We were very careful with the access for the fire brigade and with the networks underground. Everybody was happy. There was good consultation of users. The mayor was happy. And so with planting on the sides of the street and from time to time with strips of land in the middle of the space with vegetation to give really an impression that the street is like a garden. This project was presented to the official architects of the Bâtiments de France organization, as we're in a listed area, and the answer was that the atmosphere of an urban alleyway or street is not that of a suburb or a village. So we were faced with this rejection. This obviously had a bid. We had a lot of discussions with them about this, and also the mayor, Bruno Martini. And so as we had these discussions, it was accepted that we could keep the strips of greenery down the sides of the street. I don't want to be too harsh regarding the architects of the Bâtiments de France, even though we work magnificently with them on other projects. There was an architect from the Bâtiments de France who was meant to be with us, but he was called away yesterday evening. So on many, many projects, they encourage us to plant more. But on this case here, I really think the position here, the idea was that perhaps we might be planting too much and having a negative impact on the town and its atmosphere by planting too much. So in the end, this is what was done. It's successful. The effect is good. This is what it would have looked like if we could have added those beds of vegetation. We could have had a bigger impact if that had been allowed in these spaces, but it wasn't.
Okay, so the third part is selecting plants. What plants? So Paul has already raised this issue or this question. So there are two types of vegetation. One, the oceanic type, and the one here in red, which is low water plants. So this is, oh sorry, excuse me, this is one that has very little thermal impact, in fact, on heat, on temperature. Zero being heat. So zero thermophile means that it likes hot conditions. It flourishes in very hot conditions. Whereas the oceanic plants will actually contract with heat and suffer. Okay. So here, this is just giving you very rough guidelines here or definitions, but the opposition between the two, because of course within the oceanic vegetation there are xerothermophile plants. They do exist, but they're very reduced. There's not many of them. So we've got these two families of plants. So one likes high temperatures to survive. In the future, we're still okay, but we're thinking in some years that they will need irrigation to survive during very hot heat waves. And there's another. So there's our thermophile plants for dry zones that do well in very high temperatures. They don't suffer at all. They've been doing this for millions of years and they're absolutely fine. So looking at oceanic, these are the examples. This is in Pessac, in the outskirts of Bordeaux. And now examples here of xerothermophile plants in dry zones, a little drier, but it's not exotic. You know, it's not cactus. We're looking at a cactus we're looking at here. So these are habitats which were inspired us. And this is along the banks of the Garonne area here, and the Dordogne, the Garonne rivers. Very high calcium levels, and it's very nice. So this is chasmophyte plants here, and chasmophytes, they grow in cracks in rocks. And these are plants that live in very hostile conditions. And if you add a little bit of organic matter, you basically give them something to eat, they won't grow. They don't like that. They're dedicated to, they exist for these very harsh climates and difficult conditions. So here's some examples once again of some thermophile plants. And they're very nice, as you can see. So this is very abstract map here I'm showing you, but we can imagine that grey is a building. The white, there's a sports field, and the white squares are public spaces, and everything is in colour. These are spaces to be planted. So this is from a Bastide-Niel map here. So we had these exchanges with the different departments regarding the type of vegetation. What are we going to plant? Understanding, taking into account the local conditions of temperature, etc. And we thought, well, let's do a little experiment here. So we did a garden that's 3/4 dry plants. So forest, trees, pre-forest and prairie plants as well, herbaceous plants, etc. And we'll see how that works. And then there's another oceanic area here, which is very much local plants. And we know in some years they may need to be replaced or irrigated, these plants, because it will become too dry for them. So we discussed this for a long time, and we actually ended up doing this. We came back to doing a forest oceanic plants. I'm not going to accuse anyone here, but there was a really interesting discussion. For me, it's fundamental. The argument was oceanic plants, and this comes back what you were saying earlier. To refresh, to cool, we need evaporation. Great. When it's hot, we're going to irrigate. So that will cool through this condensation. The plants will draw up the water, and it will transmit this humidity to the public space. Great. But one of the questions, an important question, what happens in 5, 10, 15 years when we have heat waves? Will we be allowed to water them? And then, if we're not, what will happen? What will happen to this vegetation? So for the time being, the position of the town is to reserve spaces, keep spaces with heat-resistant planting in areas that cannot be irrigated, technically speaking. There's not that many of them, in fact, because there's a lot of watering around Bordeaux, and in spaces that are planted in mineral areas. So, for example, you can see here, for example, in these very dry areas, we plant these heat-resistant plants. But everywhere here, where there's the gardens on the left, you can see, then it's more traditional oceanic planting. An important point here, which was something so this heat-resistant planting does not have the same substrate as regular plants. It doesn't need the same conditions. Oceanic, you need some earth, etc. Get the right mix of earth, and it grows very well. But the heat-resistant plants, they grow in stones. So it's 60% stone and sand, and the rest is just some dead leaves, etc. So this does add complexity. How do we maintain this, not having this culture for maintaining and the upkeep of these plants? So therefore, we really did restrict the areas where we're putting this type of vegetation in. And we don't do this on our own, of course. We work with scientists who send us lists, etc. Then we have these images we'll stick up on the wall. And then, so it's science and aesthetics, shall we say, together. So here's some examples. We're working with Claude Figueron, a phytosociologist, and who created this space here. This is a market square with a very, very intensive use. And where space is not used, there's vegetation and there's creation of small gardens. This is what was done in Bastide and Niel. Once again, very much used. So we've got 19mm joints. You can't go beyond that because otherwise it's not good for handicapped people, but we could go to 19mm. And then very careful seeding here. So they grow slowly here. And I hope we'll have some beautiful gardens. This is a garden road or a street that was experimental, that was done previously in 2020, 2021. And that's my presentation. So, well, thank you. So there is some hope. Just a quick question. In the typology of the oceanic and heat-resistant plants, xerothermophile, in a region where there's huge amounts of rain and then no rain, can you find plants that can manage these extremes? Well, this is very important. These plants grow in ground that have stones, a majority stones, so there's a lot of filtering. So what this means is the water doesn't stagnate, it flows through straight down into the soil, which is not necessarily the case in the substrate we have here in Bordeaux. But here, in these case scenarios, when there's too much rain, the water doesn't stagnate around the roots, it flows away, so that's fine. And Loire. So listening to you, I was thinking of Bordeaux, which is built on water, and it's going to become increasingly floodable with large tides, etc. We'll see that this afternoon as there's a king tide. And sometimes we talk about Mériadeck, which has basically been built where it was a wet zone before, and therefore the buildings have been the least badly conserved because of these conditions, and therefore, listening to you, we think, oh, we'll plant the thermophile or these drought plants, but then we're talking about water falling. So this idea of flooding, the threat of water, but water that feeds, and the cycle of water. Maybe you could say a few words about that. Well, because the substrate does filter and the water can flow through, that's great. What's dangerous for plants is stagnant water. Stagnant water in ditches, etc., is problematic. There's a problem because you really do need a vegetation that adapts well to that. But for these types of plants, no, it's not a problem at all. The green oak, local plants, trees. So, if there's drainage, we can plant. Is that fair to say? Yeah. Another point, which is very interesting. We have a diversity of plants, which is much higher in poor soils than in rich soils, interestingly enough. And that's it's very interesting. So in stones and sand, you'll have a much more diverse range of plants than you will where we're providing earth and feed and what's known as rich soils, which is quite counterintuitive, really. Any questions from Manola or from Eric? Well, Manola. Yeah, I have a question, which is a nice question, please. If you could explain the principle of phytosociology. Absolutely. I often say to my architectural colleagues, they have archaic teaching when I say to this. They don't like hearing this, but the feedback we get from students is they're constantly being told that architecture will be the very heart of ecological transition. But whenever they have to do projects, there's always very little greenery in their projects, not knowing what it's doing there, how it will grow, etc. So everything you're bringing up here is absent from architectural studies. And well, for us, it's just a joke, but for fun. But this is the case, let me tell you. Architects, coming out of their studies, they're very frustrated on this subject. They have a great deal of frustration on lots of subjects, but in terms of the environment and greening and planting, they come and see us and they do great work. And they're really happy to be able to look at that as well. But that we should have landscapers working with architects systematically without wanting to. We work very well. We work very closely with architects, but they should actually come and do some work with landscape organizations as well. So, what is phytosociology? It's great. It's wonderful. It's not odd at all. In fact, it's obvious. It is sociology of plants. How they live together. How they share a lot of different things. How they help one another. How they collaborate. So it's very simple. It's habitats that have come together naturally, that have been constituted naturally, and provide a great deal of resiliency. There are 450 habitats in Europe. And why do these plants naturally associate and produce a really clearly identifiable habitat? So this is something that's of great interest to us. And we're increasingly working on this question. And when we design our landscapes, our planting, we will use identifiable landscapes, identifiable habitats, because we know they live together, they help one another, they share food and nutrition, so they provide brilliant, fantastic resiliency. So this is why we put these, how we do this, how we put our planting schemes together. It's fascinating. It goes from bacteria in the soil through to the largest of trees. And if I'm not mistaken, these are principles that are very much at the basis of new forestry. Of industrial forestry. Oh, agroforestry. Sorry, no, this is very different. There's very little to do with the ecology. How to produce, and the objective is production. There's a recent directive around the question of agroforestry, around ecology, and what you were talking about, and how there is a balance that can be established between the different trees and plants, and how the forest can therefore be reconfigured and live together in an ecosystem. Well, that's got nothing. It's not inspired by habitats. It's saying, how do we put plants in an environment, try and improve biodiversity, but with the sole production being the sole purpose objective. We don't have any production objective in terms of production. We try and develop resiliency, the plants that live among one another. But we do work on the conversion. So there we're working with architects from the French architectural government architects. So you want to be friends with everyone, with architects, with... Yeah, it's happening. We're getting there. We're progressing. So how do you put trees amongst different cultures or plants, and then how do you develop a level of biodiversity that's useful for production, that benefits production? So there is a little bit of ecology in there. There's a little bit of ecological inspiration, but it's not, strictly speaking, it's not ecological. Eric, what are you thinking about this in terms of, we're looking at Maisonneuve here on this smaller scale, and looking at different scales, from the home to the habitat to the... So what does this give you how does this feed into your work, Eric? So the first element is this true? Taking into account how plants function throughout the day with different temperatures, and how each different plant or different species will react and behave in those different environments and conditions. So that's the first thing that we looked at, we studied. Well, we put sensors around a dozen or so different species of plant. I didn't know the expression xerothermophilia or these drought-resistant plants. And one of the feelings we've had is that trees and plants that resist very well to heat do not particularly cool you down. They can even have very, very, well, they don't lose their water, they keep their water. That's how, and they do, at night, they will release a little bit, so they're not particularly useful, but they do produce shade. But often they have less leaf surface, of course, these drought plants and very dry condition plants. And the question, can you have a mix? Can you have these drought-resistant plants maybe higher up, and then there are two things around that. Let's not get too technical, please, because I've got to have a transition, so this is very important. In oceanic vegetation, there are species that do resist to very high temperatures better than others. So if you do want to do this, you need to increase the proportion of these species. If you really want to have drought-resistant plants, this has to be associated with a very specific substrate of stones and rocks and the sand in the ground. If the soil is too rich, they won't be happy, they'll die. So you need poor soil. And I think this really does represent a constraint for the different departments. Why is it died? What do we need to put there? We need to fill the hole with rocks, and it's complex. We're getting there progressively, I think, but the other point is that there are heat-resistant, drought-resistant species that, but there's not many of them that really can resist to very high temperatures, and xerothermophilous plants like this are rare. But that is how we can combine these. Well, thank you. Do we have questions? We have a couple of questions from the floor here. Okay. Hello, Isabelle Andorin. I work at Alto Step, and we work a great deal on greenery in urban environments. This is a personal question, in fact, but what are the oceanic plants that are well developed, that work with the drought conditions? Because you say it's very, very few. Yeah, there are very few. I can give you two. So green oaks and the local arbusier trees, and they're persistent as well. They're evergreen. Under a green oak, yes. You need to plant 3 then. Plant more. I can't remember what arbusier is. So, well, thank you very much. That was very, very interesting indeed. And without getting too technical, I just wanted to say, in terms of heritage and historical monuments in our emblematic neighborhoods, etc., there is also this heritage in terms of architecture, but also in terms of plants, and they're connected. And just to remind you of something very important, and this is nature does not work on the same time scale as architecture. And these frustrations we have with hesitations, I agree, I don't agree, I want to test this, I want to move forwards, I want to go faster because climate change is coming. But it takes 30 years for these plants to really work, for this change to happen. So we want people to do it fast, and so we need to accelerate. But there are a lot of things holding us back. In some towns, the challenges, in others it's impossible. And it's a question of perception, a question of culture, and a question of vision. And then there's the notion as well, a very important notion, with the DRIAL, which is a government agency. And our biggest problem is not the it's the environment is our biggest challenge. What are tomorrow's plants? You could spend a week looking for these plants as such, but we adapt as we go along. We don't know. Nobody knows really in 20 years what plants will be resistant and which will not be surviving. We need to test. In 25 years I've been working this in all of the different projects. I've introduced different plants that I didn't tell people I was testing them. I've just been doing my own private tests across all my projects. And everybody does this in the profession. The nurseries are running after just going, what do you need? What plants do you need? We said, we don't know. Test. Let's test together. This is very important. And I've got bad news for you as well, and a bad one behind afterwards. Let's be optimistic. Nature always survives. Plants always survive. We will get there. We'll manage to cool our towns down. But the bad news, I've been saying this for 20 years to Mr. Juppé, Mr. Hermique, etc., all of the mayors of Bordeaux, the plastic ancons, 900 platane trees, they're going to die. We will see them cut down in our lifetime. I'm absolutely convinced of this. There's already a third of them that are dead. 300 platane trees that died, and we're cutting them down regularly. Nobody is yet looking at the regeneration and what will the plastic ancons look like in the future. We need to look at this. We need to think about this. These illnesses are coming into the area, and this is part of our heritage. It's UNESCO heritage. The Bordeaux quaysides without cancans is not the same place. We need to prepare for this and look for different types of planting, trees, where we'll see the different perception, and we'll see what they'll look like. We'll have things of the same height and the same volume with different types of tree, which should be well adapted. And for me, this really is the question. Timing and anticipation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. We're in a heritage ecosystem. We have the plants, the nature, and we have built nature, also wildlife, the insects, which accompany the vegetation that has to be taken into account. That's the first comment I wanted to make. And in the system, there is also mankind. And to come back to what Anne-Laure said, there's the question of water, which is an issue everywhere, with the importance of the impermeability of the soil, the ground surface, and how we manage that, how we can harvest or keep water to avoid problems. So it's pedology and ecology. Okay, we're going to hand back over to our guests, and we'll resume our questions later. So we are going to finish now by turning to Manola ANTONIOLI from the School of Architecture of La Villette, a researcher in architecture and anthropology. And we wanted to conclude by listening to you as a representative of philosophy and anthropology. What can you contribute in terms of questions or issues or the incorporation of objective facts or of science? On that, nothing at all. On objective facts, nothing. No. we we work with teams of, I have anthropologists who quantify things much more than I do, but you know that research isn't just something that analyzes quantitative data. I like all philosophers, I'm going to try to look at this from a great distance, but I'll keep it short. And I'm not going to begin with Plato, don't worry. I'm going to start in the second half of the 20th century with the debate, which has been ongoing ever since. This debate would not have been possible this morning if there hadn't been the philosophical and anthropological ideas, but the debate that we have here and the ideas we're presenting wouldn't have been possible if at the end of the 20th century there hadn't been a total change philosophically and in the way people perceive the world to try to overcome the modern boundaries of mankind and of nature and technical objects also. So we don't necessarily realize this because we consider that philosophy is something for strange philosophers or strange people working in their offices, but these are ideas that do circulate in philosophy, in anthropology, and which then pass over into society. We were saying that the discussion we have here on the questions of incorporating plants into our designs, these may seem technical, but they do give rise to questions of historic and natural heritage, management of timescales. In schools of architecture, we're creating a network which will be called Chronotopia, which is going to be supported by our Ministry for Culture, and which is going to work on the links between the project and time, architecture and time. The time the plants or trees take to grow, for example. And so I do think that there is a constant dialogue between the issues we're talking about here and also philosophy, as strange as that might seem. Obviously, this is my vision of philosophy, which is why I have left my philosophy colleagues at La Villette and now work with my anthropology colleagues rather. But I do have quite a lot of philosopher colleagues who are working in the field and producing a sort of cross-breed between perhaps very obscure philosophical thinking and fieldwork outside of philosophy, and this produces some very interesting results and findings because the PhD students on both sides have started working together, and after a certain time we end up without any problems between anthropologists and philosophers who can work together. So I think that's a methodological success, a rare methodological success, which is well worth mentioning. It's a great success, I would say. Then to come back to this history of things, we need to realize that the vision of philosophy and in contact with anthropology and also with art and with studies on ecology has totally transformed things little by little. As in the second half of the 20th century, around a certain number of essential aspects, such as Part de la Nature of Philippe de Scola, who changed, perhaps not entirely, there are still some links, but who started bringing some fundamental changes to the relationship between mankind and nature and different civilizations. Obviously, we have Western philosophy, which for a long time was very Western-centric. And he, as is always the case in anthropology, he worked on showing other visions of the world from outside the Western world, and the links also between plants, animals, and humans. We can also refer to someone who became very famous at the end of his life, Bruno Latour, who, in my opinion, was far more interested in technical things than in living beings. The questions of the plants, water, and there are technical aspects there that interact with plants, with heat, with philosophers, with anthropologists, the description of inhabitants. So this idea of the relationship between humans and non-humans doesn't just concern flowers and birds. It also concerns the way our place in the anthropocentric system. And then I think another important moment is in schools of design and space. We had the same problems of magnificent projects which wanted to combine nature and architecture. But when you ask what plants do you want to put in, people have never even thought about it. They want greenery without having thought about the plants they want, and no one's actually asked, even the professors weren't asking the questions, who were preparing the doctorands for their diplomas. And at that point, we have to bring in the landscape architects to help on these subjects. So please go for the landscape architects. If you could go and work in the schools of architecture and schools of design, that would be great. And then from inside the schools of design and space, I think what was a very important trend was Clément's manifesto, which started to open up the possibility of a new approach to vegetation that isn't just geometric or decorative. So taking plants and also using the plants that arrive conveyed by the wind. And I don't know for landscape architects, but in the practice of our students working with plants, it did change the perception of things. And that is still something that's being worked on by many students. And then there's all the work of Rémi SALLES on the communication of trees, the canopy. So all these issues have circulated left, right, and centre through conferences. He was very didactic. I said was, but I don't think he's dead. I hope I didn't say something wrong there, but I didn't check. But he speaks in conferences and speaks very often in discussions between students and professors, and with a very didactic approach, and someone who inspires the students to dream, who about what they can do with trees or with plants. And the other work, which was very successful, but for which I feel much less esteem, is the work on the life of plants, Manola ANTONIOLI, which attracted a lot of media coverage, but which I philosophically find he leaves me quite indifferent. And with these non-living things, he started out talking about the relationship between humans and animals, because there we are aware of our ties with gorillas, but we're less aware of our ties with tomatoes or plants. And little by little, Mark moved on to the notion of vegetation. And this is also something that then comes up in the thinking on nature in cities. As we move away from the notion of the city as being an adversary of nature to the idea of a city which, despite all the difficulties which we have mentioned and which you know much better than I do, which can really work alongside nature and even with nature. And that is also an important reality, this transformation is something which happened over a relatively short period of time. There have been changes in the way that people view the world, think about the world. It might seem pompous saying that, but that is what has changed in just a few decades. Perhaps driven by philosophy and anthropology, but also due to the questions around ecology and the situation we all find ourselves in. And this has then become a part of a discussion on urban issues. So obviously this is a very personal view, but I prefer this research into seeing how we can change the city and its relationship with humans. And there's Nathalie Blanc, for example, a great geographer at the CNRS Research Institute, who did a doctorate PhD thesis. And it was inconceivable at the time on insects and in the city. I can imagine when she presented her thesis on cockroaches in the city, you can just, and that would have been inconceivable a short time before. But then there's also the whole wave of green walls, where very quickly we discovered that they were an ecological catastrophe. And so we have all sorts of green walls that were done. And then the other example which students which are taking the admission examinations to our schools of architecture often mention is when they're asked whether they're interested in questions of ecology, they say, yes, I think that these green walls are a good idea, because this image is one that people are very familiar with of green architecture, but it's an aspect of gentrification which creates districts for billionaires, like in Milan, and the local people in towns never have access to the trees or to the plants, and these things are only done decoratively. So for me, that is a total failure. We shouldn't be going in that direction. And so a lot of work is done in our center, a critical work on greening, not criticism of greenery in the city as such, but of the uses that are sometimes made of greening, especially the fact that often it's a driver of inequality and gentrification. You say no, but I think it can be. And so personally, I am interested in the approaches, philosophical approaches, but not only, also practical approaches which try to combine environmental and social ecology and also mental ecology. As was mentioned earlier, the fact that living in a green space makes people want to walk more. That's a question of mental ecology, and it's not the same time as it's not the same as when you go out and you're surrounded by concrete. It does make a difference. Or butterflies as well. Butterflies and birds. Often we don't see butterflies and birds anymore, but there's also the question of biodiversity, which is very urgent. We no longer see there's the disappearance of glowworms and other insects. When I was a child, in August, there would be clouds of glowworms. I no longer see them. I used to see swallows when I was a child. I don't see them anymore. Mosquitoes as well. Although in Paris, there's plenty of rats and also bed lice and things like that. But all these other species are disappearing. And there's also the question of uses and gentrification. And also the question of plants used as a decoration, in a sense of decorum, as in Latin, for show in the street. There was a very good book by Nicolas Touzier a few years ago, Let's Win Back Our Streets, on how to take ownership of street spaces. And for me, in the way we think about how we develop space, I think this is very important. So there's the notion of decorum and appearance, especially in a heritage monumental city. We need to have that decorum. The plants mustn't just wander off all over the place as if they were wild. And this difficulty that you highlighted, which is that where you propose something on the basis of your knowledge and of your desires, and that afterwards it all gets redesigned to make it more geometrical, more tame, hiding this behind the fact that we need to have access for the fire brigade. But often it's just that people don't want to have all these foreign plants wandering all over the place, or plants which aren't noble, like the weeds we see here on the photograph. So decorum, this importance of vegetal decorum, which combines with social decorum. And these are the pitfalls of this. And what I wanted to say to conclude, because I've already gone over time, is that personally, for having spent a part of my life in a very small town, I am not one of those who think that the town is an adversary of nature, and that it's better to go off and take everything and live in rural places without communicating with people. So we have people who move out of Paris and who go and do teleworking from the provinces, but often they end up coming back. So we have seen this rural exodus after COVID, but now we're seeing everybody coming back, all of these former city dwellers who are bored out of their minds in the country and are coming back. So for me, I think once again, obviously this is just my opinion, I think rather than going back to live in a small town, I would rather die, to be honest. And perhaps the countryside is more interesting, but when you have lived in Paris, people who've lived in Paris or Bordeaux might find it wonderful to go and seek refuge in these spaces, but the provinces, really the countryside, isn't some the stuff of dreams. And when you're living alone in the country and you don't know how to even grow your own tomatoes, it can be complicated if you have a field or if you have something to do there. So I really think it's much more interesting, rather than heading off to live outside of the city, to continue following the trend which we're all trying to contribute towards with our respective difficulties. But when we're discouraged, we also have to think about the things that can be done, which have just been developed over the last 10 or 20 years, and it will take time to do what we are doing in our cities. Thank you very much. Okay, I don't know if there are any questions about that. Yeah, I had a question after what you were saying about animals in the city. Do you consider that today, with industrial and chemical-driven agriculture in our countrysides, is it not our cities that can become the havens of biodiversity rather than the countryside with all those chemicals in agriculture? Is that a possibility or not? I can't demonstrate this because I don't have the statistics to do so, but I have a lot of colleagues working on this question and who are discovering that there are species which are dying in the countryside, the way the countryside is now. And we shouldn't forget that the current farmers' revolts are being driven by the agricultural unions. And so there are species, I know there's the falcon, which are starting to seek refuge in cities. And there were students in space design in Lyon who designed refuges for not bees, not for solitary bees, for wild bees, the ones that don't live in hives. And so they did a whole project to try to build spaces for these wild bees so that they can seek refuge in these spaces. So for those who I hear around me, according to people around me who are specialists, yes, apparently this is the case. Any other questions? Eric or Rémi, do you have any questions? She has challenged you there with her ideas. It's just an idea. In the guidance that some local authorities in towns and cities are seeking in their greening urban projects, I don't have any examples where philosophers are involved in the processes. They're not involved in the process as, let's say, in a practical, official way, because I think they're probably too hostile to any sort of hierarchy and don't want to sort of sit on committees. But I'm thinking in terms of the support, I think there are some, and that's starting to happen even if the schools of architect have very few philosophers, but there are sociologists, artists, all sorts of different people. But there are philosophers who are taking part in think tanks or working groups working on this sort of issue. And that should probably happen more often. I think in Belgium, it's more frequent. There are countries where it's something you do find more often. And in France, where we tend to be headed in the wrong... It is something that was common in the 70s, but now people think architecture should be something more scientific, more technical, and should just be a matter of engineering, but engineering without any thought or thinking. I think it's a shame, though. I think it's interesting to have the different viewpoints on an issue like this, but in fact, it's just a sort of continuum. We can't compartmentalize, separate the different views we have of the local territory, which is so diverse. And in relation, coming back to what you're saying, when you're working with a local territory, we have to work with different departments, development, urban planning, business, which may have different expectations, and it's not always easy to reconcile, to structure all of this, to try to come up with an action plan. And I think we need to have this support, but looking at things, taking a step back to look at these things differently with the philosopher's view to provide a perspective. But when you were talking about method, I work, because thinking is work. I work a lot on the notion of transversality, which is applied in the sector in debates around institutional psychotherapy or psychology, but at the same time it's very different from what we call from pedagogical design, as we say in engineering. That's a term I really don't like, as if pedagogy could be engineered or designed. So since Socrates, these are things which are totally opposed. But that's just an aside. But the idea is that we talk about transdisciplinarity, which often means that we just do books together in which there's one chapter by a landscape architect, one by a geographer, one chapter by a philosopher. So transdisciplinarity really is a challenge to see how we can put together a team with the engineer, the landscape architect, the geographer, the historian, the artist, all the different people who should be represented to make their contribution. The contribution of artists can be important in transforming things, and anthropologists. So in recent times, anthropologists, philosophers all seem to be the same thing to me, especially as in the past, anthropologists all had training in philosophy, as did the sociologists. There was a common philosophical basis, foundation for all of us. But we used to have this common core, and today in my work and with my PhD students, I'm finding that transdisciplinary, transversal approach. Initially we were political refugees trying to adapt to our environment, and now these students have come up with new methodologies, new subjects, new issues to address. So I have students who spend years studying Foucault and who then go and work very practically on how homeless people are handled in public spaces. And this comes up with some very surprising things, very impressive things, through their intelligent and their subtle views. Thank you very much.
So there really is an invitation here for an methodological articulation here around the different actors, and therefore I just perhaps may add a comment myself. And the benefit of these meetings and these looking at these different territories between different metropolitan areas, different geographies, etc. And just a quick anecdote for you that may be of interest, but we recently welcomed a delegation from Togo, and for elected officials from Togo, and they came to talk about public policies in terms of climate change and at the agency. So we presented the work we were doing and looking at how you can plant 1 million trees and what we could do to support that. And we were saying, well, this is a very new subject for us, and Togo's equatorial, so there's a huge forest all around them going down to the sea. And we said to them, well, tell us a little bit about, we talk a lot about technical techniques, but what would you have to say? What would your comments be? And this is where I found it was very interesting, because they were silent, and then they said, well, in Togo, as is the case in a lot of African countries, the forest and the tree, we have a very different approach to plants in the city, because in every village we have a sacred forest, which is reserved and protected for what they represent, for their religious aspect, spiritual aspect. We also often have a medicinal forest, and the tree is part of healthcare. The use of plants for medical treatment. And for us, where we plant most is where their inhabitants, because people are requesting this, because the palabra tree is very strong with the public spaces, so the tree provides the shade, so it's where people can group together, come together, because they're not there's shared spaces that are owned by nobody but owned by everybody, where you can do whatever you want. They're in the public space. So 3 different approaches, which could perhaps be useful for us in terms of thinking about our strategies, to think about plants as being a shared space. It's not shared space, shade for the sake of shade, but shade as a meeting space, and in terms of sacred and spiritual. And indeed, yeah, along the lines of what you're saying, I've often thought this, had the impression, even conviction, that this kind of debate, when we talk about ecology, etc., we are lacking research from Africa and thinking from Africa, because there's Asians, there's Latin America, etc., and African researchers have a lot of challenges to have visas to come to these events, for example. But also, personally, I find that I don't know anything about African philosophy, and they have a different vision of the world, which are very rich, and there's a lot of philosophy, genuine philosophy there as well. We need to widen our collaborative network and to Africa. Any other questions from the floor, perhaps? Are we okay on timing? And then we'll hand over to our Mr. Jean-Jean, our elected officials. Hello, I'm an architect in Nice. I'm responsible for World Heritage and for the management of the UNESCO sites. And I had a question, Mr. LARREY. You were talking about accessibility of green spaces, and I'm talking about private and public spaces. And this is a subject that Anne-Laure spoke to me about as well. This is very interesting, to cool down, or you need to sit down in these spaces or go through these spaces. No accessibility, therefore, is very important. And you were talking about eventually opening up school courtyards, playgrounds. Did I understand that? But that also that means in terms of parks that are closed at night, often they're gated at night. And this does raise questions about access, private, public, and where we can go, where we can't go, because the idea here is being to survive in heat waves and be comfortable. So these spaces that people can access. I don't know if the question was very clear, but the idea of how will these spaces be used? We talk about pathways and routes through public spaces, but tomorrow, when it's very hot, how will we survive? It goes back to what Mr. SALLES was saying as well. How will we cool down under a hedge unless they're very big and very old? We spoke about a lot of different subjects, but survival, I didn't completely understand, perhaps. Anybody got do you have a survival plan? And then changing the paradigm, thinking about public spaces differently. Maybe you should be able to access cool areas at any time, even at night, and then within a 300-meter radius of one's home. Where we were talking about schoolyards, but this idea, this question of greening school courtyards, and if you look at the primary school spaces, and it's very low proportion of public spaces. But I think one of the things regarding these spaces is to sensibilize these and make children aware of biodiversity, plants, and the importance of greening, because otherwise the impact itself is not particularly significant. But that said, a primary school courtyard, which are between 600 900 square meters, you can't green the whole space and landscape the whole space, of course. There's a real challenge in terms of the acceptability in terms of the teaching team, parents. You have sites where people really want to have planting everywhere, and you don't want kids with their hands in the mud and eating the earth. And yet it's very good for your health to eat soil. Yeah, I agree with that. And therefore this does lead to difficulties. And then in terms of opening these sites and accessibility to these sites, in terms of security, safety, children's safety, etc. And when we talk about this change in thinking, faced with this climate change and the changes that brings, this does become an important question. So even in third sites, you have landscaped spaces which are completely closed off and gated off, and therefore opening them up does raise the same questions once again. But it is moving. There is an evolution in the thinking about this, because the question's out there now. And one of the things we're hoping for from doing this mapping is to talk to the private sector and to say, well, the public sector's doing this, and we can only impact 40% of the territory, for example, as a general rule, not necessarily Bordeaux. It's generally about that. 60% is private. So therefore, if we want to act, we need the private sector to participate in this. So it can be donations, etc. People with their own individual gardens doing things. But then you've got the large property developers as well. What can they be doing? And sometimes you can have refusal from owners and property owners because there's more and more closed off, secured spaces, gated communities, and therefore we're making these areas completely private for these specific sites, these buildings. So there are several hundred people who have access to this park space or greenery, and at some point we will have to open these up and make them available to people. And we need to change with this, but it's very difficult to do. And we're not necessarily, it's not technical here, it's a question of acceptability. And for example, schoolyards, how can we open them in the summer? We're thinking about this. Well, for the 2 months of the summer holidays, okay, we can put systems in to protect access to the classrooms, but there's not just the summer holidays, there's also during the school year as well. This can happen. It could be about 6 months of high temperatures and there's schools still going. So how do we make these spaces available, for example, after the end of the day from 5 p.m. onwards? So we can quickly find ourselves in discussions in terms of the multi-use of buildings. So some buildings are used in the summer for accommodation for students, for people in work placements, and so there are solutions that do exist. And the elements that we can provide are giving, objective perspectives. There's hundreds of thousands of meters of space that can be made available. But in terms of responsibility, security, and safety, for example, they are enormous. They need to be taken into account. But I think this is what will be, as we move ahead, one of the keys that will be very important to dealing with this question. The collective space that's publicly owned will not be enough. Well, thank you very much to our 3 speakers and for having participated in this discussion. And now we're going to hand over to Mr. Jean-Jean, who's going to talk to us about public spaces, végétalisation, greening. A few words, therefore, please. So I have a portable microphone, so I will stay in my seat. First thing, I'm contributing to this disequilibrium between men and women, so I'd like to thank Anne Muir not for having had a balance, but facilitating the work in terms of organizing these 2 days, particularly this round table, which was extremely instructive, very interesting indeed. So thank you very much, Anne-Laure, and thank you to the 4 of you for participating in the discussion. As it is really very, very interesting because we learned a great deal, or I learned a great deal anyway, and it will help us think about the question that we're here for today is in terms of greening and landscaping our environment in terms of cool down our cities. And I took some notes, and among other things, what I knew is we don't know. We don't know, and this is perhaps a concern. It's a bit scary. I'd like to come back to a few points, notably in terms of what we're doing in Bordeaux, because that was the purpose of this 2-day symposium, and regarding what was just discussed in terms of public spaces, and public spaces represent at most about half of the urban space. So in Bordeaux, we're working on this idea of greening all of our schoolyards. And to share our experience here in Bordeaux, we've come out of a test or requiring people get involved. It's a town project, it's funded, and 100% of our schools will be dealt with in the next 10 years. The objective, there are multiple objectives, I'll go fast. One is having more nature, more greenery, opening up these spaces, not only in the summer, but also in evenings and weekends. And we'll have some feedback in the coming years for new sites. On the older sites, of course, everything has to be adapted to opening up to the public, but on new sites, it can be taken into account from their conception. And the reflection is also based on what we can call no man's lands in terms of larger spaces, very individual, unique spaces. And with the different technical expertise we have in our departments, we're looking at, for example, crossroads. These roads that they're not perpendicular, but they're often at angles, and these are angles that they can be fairly poor, shall we say, and all of these spaces, which are micro spaces, we're working on them and we're re-greening them because the priority is in terms of water management. And the town as a sponge, bringing nature back into town, and then in the best case scenarios, introducing trees. But trees themselves are not necessarily the priority. It's not the main objective, a quantitative objective in the town, because we did discuss this. For us, it's schools, crossroads, small squares which have roads all around them, and we're looking at this as well. Something else we can share is that a triangular space has 3 streets around it, that a square will have 4. Are they all necessary? Could we reduce some road space? We'll be looking at that this year. We've got projects initiated and they are starting to come. They're losing one roadway so that they can be better managing water, etc. And then there's the question of no man's lands. We've got lots of examples of these in Bordeaux, where it's much more practical, in fact, in terms of investment and in terms of management costs. To this could be bowling areas, etc., where we can make them more natural but keep them as social areas, or the Brandenburg Square, for example, which is this very big, it's a huge roundabout. It's not even a roundabout because there's no cars going around it really, and this will become natural again and it will be planted and landscaped. And so this is an example, Madame, for us to bring life, human life to these spaces. And I'm not sure gentrification is a marker of renaturing, but we will be able to bring benches and fountains, drinking fountains, not necessarily aesthetic fountains, not from an architectural perspective anyway, but recreating spaces, shared spaces where people can come and relax, play with their children, or play with their kids. We work on different streets as well. Rémi SALLES was mentioning this. Very interesting, as usual, very clear. I won't go back over what he said, but there's a lot of work being done on here along the quaysides and the boulevards, which is a ring road going around the town. And then a couple more points as well, things that are preventing us from progressing and from progress. So working with ABF is with the Bâtiment de France, so that's France architecture. Even though in Bordeaux, they're obviously driving themselves, they drive renaturing and greening, and often it can be a technical challenge as well. But the challenge from a political perspective that we find that we have to deal with the most, or we're the most confronted with, is culture. How do inhabitants take ownership? Do they get involved in these green spaces, in these landscaped areas? They can often be seen as being dirty, dangerous, open at night. And so this is something that has to be dealt with as well. We need to have some courage to this, to be able to convince people for this. We've got a 4-hectare park opening. It'll be open day and night in an area which is not the easiest area in terms of safety and security, and therefore there's a great deal to be done in terms of training and educating and informing people, and we're working on this, and to be able to explain to people that this is positive. Among other challenges we're faced with, and to end on a positive note, the ability of the municipality to support. So we were talking about the planting trees on beech trees, and there's xerotermophilous plants as well. We are here as elected officials to provide you with support, to work with you on these things. This is one of the reasons why we have these events, and we'll be working together over the next 2 days together. So I'm very keen to work with you on these questions, and pavements as well are very poor areas, and this can be very important for the development of certain types of plants. Yes, just to say, when we do demineralize areas, we recover stones. We get the stones out of doing that. We're smashing up pavements, and we get the stones from them. Delacroix also doing some interesting work on that. And a last point, which is preservation. We haven't spoken about that this morning, but before thinking about regeneration and here in the city of Bordeaux, we're also thinking about protecting the existing plant life in the town. And I must say that, remember, the first subject that I was confronted with Bordeaux was a square in a protected area, and everybody was delighted it had been built. Everybody was delighted with this new life it had brought, but there were 17 different monuments. They were reaching the height of the buildings around them, beautiful monuments in the spring, and they were with living plants, biodiversity, monuments. We're talking about trees here that provided cooling and shadow and condensation, and they were also very attractive. And I don't know if we said as well, but also, and this is perhaps for our philosopher, but these are monuments of memories, and we don't speak about this a great deal, but trees at the foot of which my grandfather used to sit with me on the bench. The tree when I was a student, where we used to spend evenings on the grass under the trees. So these are monuments that also provide memories. And on this fantastic square that's been renovated for 10 million euros, it's that these 17 monuments were cut down. The stream was dried out, and it's just a sad hole with a fountain, which provides a chlorinated atmosphere. So there's no longer the heron on the square. And what we could hope for, and something this could be think about with the architects of France, is to have something similar into an organization where we have France architecture that protects buildings, and perhaps we need something similar for trees. Trees of France, where we are protecting and have some kind of entity, some kind of public body. And Rémi, you would be paid to replant, but like architects, but protecting our heritage, our living heritage. That'd be a nice dream, wouldn't it? The creation of an institution that allows us to protect what exists already, and to think about all of the different work from a philosophical perspective, technical perspective, landscape perspective, to think about this. Thank you very much. Well, thank you to you all. So we've completed our morning session, which was really to get us all up to speed together. And I think that's been a very transversal moment we've had this morning. So now we'll invite you to go downstairs, down to on the right-hand side. There is a buffet lunch waiting for you this afternoon. There are 4 groups, 4 visits. You should be enrolled in one of the groups. You still have time to do so. And the lists are downstairs as well, so come and see me. There's group 1 is with Sylvain, who you can see here standing with the cap. Group 2 is with Anne-Laure, who's talking. Group 3 is with Emmanuel. Stand up, please, Emmanuel, on the other side of the room, the lady there. And group 4 is accompanied with, is going to the Bassin à Flot, and that's with Jean-Christophe here.